Welcome to this SEEPS webinar. I'm Rob Straw. I'm the CEO of SEEPS Zurich campus and the European operations based in Horgen, Switzerland, just outside of Zurich. SEEPS is committed to building a bridge between China and Europe through its courses and its offerings and its webinars like today. Our presence in Europe has been cemented by the establishment of this campus that we have here in Horgen in 2015. And we focus on dialogue and collaboration between organizations and firms on both sides of this bridge. We're all aware of the pressures on the global supply chain, the various factors that are currently impacting supplies. I guess your firm and your family has been impacted like our firm and organization and our family. In this webinar, we're very thankful to have Roland Berger's Manish Marwaha with us, who is a friend and a former student of mine as well, for a discussion on how companies can plan, can prepare, and also ultimately be more resilient in the face of disruption. When we were talking about this and planning this, we realized it's a very complex issue. Disruption, resilience in the face of disruption and supply chain and policies and the geopolitical tensions and there's many cuts to this diamond. And I phrase it as a diamond because it is something that is astonishing to watch and to look at, but it's very difficult to manage. And that's what we're here to look at. Manish Marwaha has 20 years of experience in leading wide-ranging strategic and operational as well as financial transformations for different organizations. His experience in leading global, multicultural, and high-performing teams ranges from the board and to the C-level executives, as well as all the way down to the line floor. So he's not a stranger to walking the floors of the shop. Currently a partner at Roland Berger. Again, very happy to have him here with us. Manish and his wife actually were former students of mine. I'm especially proud of both of their successes, and I'm very thankful that he's taken up the opportunity for my invitation to today's speech and discussion. Manish, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And Robert, thanks for the exchanges over the years during the time we were students and beyond. And it's an honor to be here. I'm Manish. My former colleagues at COFCO gave me a Chinese name, Ma Mingse. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but they said it meant. I had a few things to say which were worth listening to. I'm part of Roland Berger's Zurich office, and I focus on two pillars. One is commodities. These are inputs to everything we do: the food we eat, the cars we drive, the electricity that comes in, and also into the asset-backed commodity trading side of it. So working with the agri-commodity players, the oil and energy players, etc. And on the other side, on the industrials, where I spend a lot of time working with equipment and energy utilities companies, and also companies which do engineering, procurement, and construction. Things which I'm very passionate about are how global trade flows impact strategy and what companies need to do to address it. I spend a lot of time working on topics around resource security, whether it's inputs, whether it's food, depending on the topics with corporations, states or sovereign wealth funds. And of course, related to complete the cycle, it is about how do you bring in changes that ensure access, availability, stability, so that you can have continued operations, right? And transformation is just linking it all together. So I'd just like to say that the focus of today's discussion is more looking at industrials side of it, because the agricultural impact needs a completely different focus discussion. And just to start off with, I think it's important to say, why are we here today, right? Now, over the past few years, we have witnessed very extreme and very severe personal and economic shocks, right? Well, it might be fair to say that COVID is kind of an event that happens once a century, or there are unprecedented circumstances. We try to look a bit deeper into this whole discussion. So the World Bank says that in the past 50 years, about 10 major events took place, right? Now, when you look at the frequency and the intensity of these events, right? So then you realize that initially we were talking about approximately 10 years, 5 years gaps between major events. And here, just for the benefit of everyone, I've only focused on commodity inputs, because commodities are a reflection of the supply and demand, which is critical to the economic drivers in society. The stock markets or the stock prices sometimes have a disconnect with that. So, for example, if you look at the fertilizer prices, it gives you an indication of what is happening also in the agriculture industry. If you look at metals and minerals, of course, that's an input to iron and steel, to cars, to metalworks, etc. Right? Same thing with energy, etc. as well. Right? So what we notice is that there have been, let's say, as per World Bank, and major economic disruptions from 1970 to approximately to 2000. There have been kind of two of note: the oil crisis and the recessions between 1990 and 95. Thereafter, there have been 8. So, and when we look into this 8 and we zoom in, we see that they have been occurring more frequently. Now, you can see several factors, right? There's a global financial crisis, there's a commodity price booms, the Arab Spring, COVID-19, and then we had Ever Given's being stuck in Suez Canal, and then we have the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and we're still trying to get over some of these elements, right? Now, is this the last disruption? Clearly not. Is there going to be a disruption next year? Don't know. But will it be another 10 years before we have another disruption? It seems less likely, right? So it's more likely that we either have the prolonged effects of what we're going through, or they are emphasized or augmented or amplified by something else. Because if you look at the situation with COVID-19, you're saying we had a significant drop in demand. So there was a demand destruction at an unprecedented scale, which led to a significant correction of all the key commodities. But ever since, there has been a significant recovery in all of these things. And when we were already in an environment of elevated commodity prices, and then when the Ukraine-Russia crisis occurred, it made things worse. Now, that's probably a good segue going in. So why did Ukraine and Russia, for example, make things work? Just the share of energy and chemicals in that area, and also metals and key inputs coming from Russia. So about 15% of potassic fertilizers, about 20% of ammonia, 50% of neon, significant share of precious metals, 25% palladium, etc. All of these are significant agricultural inputs. Significant industrial inputs. Agricultural inputs, is the dependence is much higher. Then you also have Ukraine as in many cases the backbone, the low cost manufacturing or assembly destination for a lot of the European industrial companies. So that's also how we are looking at components and sub-assemblies being. Now, what has been the impact? So there are two dimensions of the impact. One is the timing duration. How long do we expect some of these disruptions to take place, or the impact of the disruption to take place? And on the other side, what are the categories of the impact? On a very simplified manner, if when you look at it, there is the price increase of underlying commodities, which has certain effects, and there is the actual physical supply shortage or disruption of that. Now, out of these, I would say this is the lesser of two evils. Again, why? Because of course you have an elevation in these prices from a company point of view. You still have access to your materials. You can still make those products, even though at a higher cost. And then it's a question of, are you able to work with these higher costs? Is there a market at this time? And a lot of these things are also then driving inflation, and it is something that we are all experiencing right now. On the other hand, when we are talking of material flow interruption, this is when we have to make choices. We are talking about rationing. We are talking about limited access. We need to significantly adjust demand because there is just not enough supply. Here on the left side, demand adjusts simply because of the price elasticity. But here, demand is forced to adjust. So even if you're willing, for example, to tank your car at $10 a gallon, but if there's no fuel, then you cannot, right? So in these elements, and then when we look at the impact of such things, for a long time we've had shortage of semiconductors. Neon as an important gas is an input for these semiconductors. Palladium, which is critical for catalytic converters, falls there. Gas, which is basically important from the very basics, from heating in both industrial and residential, to fuel for energy. And what is more important for the industrial side of it is a key input for fertilizers, for chemicals, and all of these things. So when we are talking of gas shortages, which we are discussing right now in Europe, for example, this means that there could be, in case of shortage, significant supply disruption here, wherever there is the gas access. So that's why this is important, and that's why from this chart, I think what you could see is some of the effects are shorter term. Q3 22, Q4 22, at a high inflationary pressure, there is some expectation that oil would probably adapt. We'll see if that happens. But then on the longer term, many of these inputs, which are critical for long lead items, that are going to persist. Now, is this a global problem? Is this a regional problem? Now, it is clearly a global problem on some cases, especially when you're talking elevated commodity prices, especially when you're talking shortage of things like fertilizer, of semiconductors and fertilizers, for example. But then when we look at it a bit closely, some regions are affected more than others. You see, we have come after several decades of globalization and supply chain optimization, design, etc. We were trying to find the balance between cost, availability, and lead times, and also efficiency. That means we try to go to best cost countries. We try to find a good trade-off between cost and lead times for critical items. So there was a regionalized spread of the supply chain, and then to make everything efficient, we were trying to minimize inventory and get into just-in-time kind of production, right? Which all works, is the right thing to do when everything works. But when you start having shortages, there isn't enough inventory in the supply chain, for example, to cushion against these shortages. Just one example, right? So this is where you see the entire American continent, for example, North America and US, etc., for example, works with Mexico as as one of its key manufacturing back offices. in Europe, for example, this is why there is a high dependence on Russia and Ukraine in this case, and it doesn't just affect industrial places like Germany, etc. The closer you go to Russia, there's even higher, even cultural dependence and dependence on many other inputs there. And if you see in the trade flows, you can see that Europe is 7 times bigger, has a 7 times bigger trade with Russia and Ukraine compared to the Americas, right? Asia has as well, but these are again certain different elements going a lot to China and India and some parts of ASEAN, and we have seen that this hasn't been hampered to the same extent as the rest of it. Now, when we what in such a situation, what needs to happen or what can happen? So trade flows are already adapting to a certain extent with some limited success. This is happening more as a mitigation measure with the hope that maybe, and the question we get asked quite often is, over the next 12 to 18 months, maybe there'll be some kind of a solution, some kind of a practicality where we could go back to those trade flows, albeit with either some financial costs or certain embargoes, etc. But that's the hope. But at the same time, in the near term, as well as in the longer term, firms and governments are forced or are compelled to carefully look at their extended supply chains, not just from a tier 1, but tier 4, tier 5, because they've realized that perhaps it's a small part which goes, which by value isn't so significant, but the inputs for it depend on a certain chemical or in a certain adhesive, which depends on its inputs for and is not available. So you could not, for example, ship a plane because a certain part is missing, right? So that readaptation is already being discussed. We have seen for gas, for example, the treaty between Germany and Qatar. There's talk of readaptation of gas flows across the Atlantic, etc. And some of this will get permanent. In the meantime, this has created a lot of transparency for companies to see where the vulnerability is, or is still asking companies to create more transparency on their supply chains and carefully think about bringing in redundancy, resilience from the design flow. So some impacts that we see, right? So the conversion cost of metals has gone up significantly. The chemicals, especially in Europe, the chemicals industry is significantly on the brink of having shutdowns, not just the cost increases in gas and oil for lack of availability of gas. That's going to have, imagine what that does to a BASF, for example, right? In the automotive sector, there has been a significant impact of all of these inputs, whether it's non-ferrous metals, whether it's chemicals and plastics, steel, etc. And of course, the cost of the car, and you've seen the cost of used car go up as well significantly. Not to add the fact that some of the elements, for example, outlined catalytic converters and semiconductors have been in significant shortage in the past. Now, with this scenario, is there nothing companies can do? Is there nothing that we can think of to amend or ameliorate the situation? Well, there is only so much you can do, but there are some key elements to think of. First is, for each company, to look at what is our exposure to certain inputs. So what is a true vulnerability to disruption? What does that entail? We are talking about transparency of the supply chain, a clear clear and shared understanding of what is strategic and what is nice to have, what needs to be secured and what needs to be procured. You know, there's nuances there which are very critical. What are the risks that we can have? And these are risks from geopolitics. These are risks from not having access to certain inputs, or competition for limited resources. To give you an example, we're all very very motivated and inspired to make the energy transition for all good reasons. Now, what this is doing is this is putting a lot of different industries in competition for the same resources. The amount of metal that goes in an electric car is on average 4 to 6 times, depending on the material, of course, higher than what goes into ICE, right? Does it mean we should not go for electrification? No, that's not the point. The point is there's only so much metal being mined. And to keep up with the significant increase in metal demand, that means we have to mine more metal, we have to recover more metal from what is currently being wasted or trashed. So it creates those pressures, and it just is a question of giving it time and having a clear plan and making it happen, right? So again, what are the risks and what is the significance? How does it impact? Is it a financial risk? Is it a disruption risk, and so on and so forth? How prepared are you for these risks? Again, price increases, supply disruptions, looking at critical materials and critical intermediates, right? And then how do you redesign your organization? And this is in terms of different timeframes, short to medium term, in terms of, is your organization able to anticipate and react to any disruptions, and how quickly and how effectively can it react to such disruptions? And on the second side, how can these shocks be transferred or transmitted during the supply chain? This covers short term, right? On the longer term, topics around supply chain redesign, nearshoring, onshoring, insuring. So those kind of discussions. Are you designing, when you design your next, let's say a car, or let's say your phone, are you able to build in switchability? Are you able to build in disruption readiness in sourcing materials? That means, would you consider, or should you consider, having a backup material? So if it's, let's say you're creating a phone with titanium, because of its properties, should you also build into your production processes an alternative metal, so that should titanium become scarce, you are able to switch it with ease and deliver the same product with minimal interruptions. In terms of manufacturing, engineering, product design, how can you bring in resilience in terms of, for companies, even service, for example, what you do when you do not have certain critical parts? How can you bring in substitutability in parts, for example? And then on a bigger side, of course, on the commercial side, how do we take this? And not just at the group level or board level, we have to bring it down, and not just down in the product level, but somewhere connecting the two, so that the corporate or the in many cases the state's strategic priorities are clearly trickle down to the operational level. Right? We believe a neat way to do that is what we call an assessment framework, because for the design for disruption DNA, the design for disruption DNA comes from the fact that disruption and is omnipresent. It's going to is just around the corner. You don't know where it is going to hit. Also, we as an organization should reorient ourselves and should have disruption readiness in the DNA. Right now, in the previous slide, I spoke about the assessment of the different vulnerabilities either by suppliers, by materials, by human capital, and other things. And here it's a 2x1 framework which talks about the duration of the impact and the area of the impact. So let's take a practical example. Let's say there is one disruption which affects there's a disruption, say supply chain interruption, because ports are blocked in one region of the world, and that affects either price change because of higher higher pressure on the supply and demand, or it leads to disruption. But the duration is either short term or it can sporadically occur. So it happens now and then, but and when it occurs, it's for a shorter duration. So what you can do there is you can mitigate, and having a mitigation plan for such keys, such issues is critical. You cannot really redesign your entire organization to just take care of something which may or may not occur, and if it occurs, it sticks around for a short time, right? So it's also important in the disruption that we are able to, in the disruption assessment and readiness, we're able to prioritize what should we change for, what should we adapt for, and what we should not, and what we should just be ready for. Then when we talk about as a duration of impact, we say is sustained or longer term. And if they are talking of price changes, and we say, well, there can be price increases or price decreases or significant volatility in prices for a longer time, then it's more about how do you share or transfer or get away from this risk. So what do you mean by share or transfer? Share it in terms of, for example, suppliers and customers through by adjustment of commercial contracts, reflecting this volatility or this elevation, so that you are not personally affected to that extent. It is by bringing in a higher degree of organizational competence to deal with risk. So stronger risk focus, risk mitigation, risk transfer elements. You're talking insurance, you're talking hedging, both physical and financial, which needs to make itself as part of the, for example, procurement or sourcing DNA. And to give you an example of where we expect that there could be a supply shortage or a disruption, but when it occurs, it stays for a longer term. This is where you have to take it deeper into the product design, into the operation design, into the supply chain design, because this is where substitution and switchability is very critical. To give you an example, let's pick the dash of a car, and let's say certain features are available in the premium models, and that has a different in-car dash, and certain features are in the let's say freemium version, and that has slightly different dimensions, that has slightly different outline, of course, to preserve look and feel. But in case of disruption, it might be very important to go on a platform approach so that if you have an issue with, let's say, the high-end materials, you are still able to work with the lower-end materials, but ship out cars, right? So at least the physical dimensions, at least the front-end customer-facing inputs, or the back-end wiring and everything else is to a certain extent switchable and substitutable. And same thing to go with suppliers and partners, for example. But these are just some examples. The underlying part is first having a clear idea of what are you vulnerable towards. Are you talking about significant inputs that have a significant share of your spend, or are you talking about small spend but critical supplies where you are maybe one of the smaller supplier and are going to be kicked out when there is a high demand from other big players, right? And then what are the areas of impact that can or disruption types of disruption that can affect you, and when that occurs, how long is it going to affect you, right? So some general dimensions around that extent, both to understand where you are vulnerable and how do you react. With that, I would say we could go out and take some questions. Thank you.
Manish, thanks so much. We do have some interesting questions coming in. A couple would be, one is, you didn't mention China. What do you see and what are you observing with this, you said Asia a little bit on some of the trade stuff that you're seeing. China has made this commitment to dual circulation, and it's nothing new for most countries, that is first focusing on developing and establishing that domestic market and then the external market. Do you see anything here specifically regarding China?
I would say China, like all countries, is taking this disruption very, very seriously. And there are two reasons for that. One is a lot of the global supply chain depends on China, because it is the de facto largest supplier of inputs, equipment, etc. around the world, right? So the world counts on China, and China has to be resilient for the world, because that's the role it has taken up and wants to do. And second is also towards its own citizens and to keep the economy, because China has for a long time used lockdowns, etc., to mitigate or to control some of the spread of geographies, right, of COVID, etc. And China has also realized that there is a lot of value that is left before things are going into the bin. And as a country which wants to be a leader in all dimensions, not just as a leading manufacturer, etc., and to also reduce their carbon footprint. And over the past years, China has made resources, efficiency, automation, advancement, innovation key focus as part of its strategy. So this is all using this burning platform to make it permanent, so that it's not just temporary, that we are trying to mitigate shortages, etc., but saying, okay, let's make it part of our culture. Let's be more sustainable. And I think this is where it is being driven from. And the beauty is, given China's economic size and the consumption, any small step has a big impact.
Right.
Globally.
Another question came up on, you're talking about, you said nearshoring, onshoring, inshoring. And the question around this is not just for goods and industrials. How does this affect, in your view? I know it's not your center of your work, but on services side of people, you know, you know exactly what I mean with these nearshoring factories for the finance, for the back office, whatever. How is this affecting the supply chain?
So it has three dimensions, right? One is the economic value that is the shift in economic value from one geography to the other. So let's say from a farther away geography to a nearer geography, right? Which has both, which in one element has cost impact and in the other element has a skills impact, right? The second is the change in the dimension of the services. So when you're talking about nearshoring, inshoring, especially on the services side, given the differentiated cost basis, and let's take the example that you're moving it from a lower cost country to a more expensive country, then it's also about added value. So there is a natural market push to saying, okay, we what we were getting out of low cost country A, now that you're here, and you should be in theory more productive, or we want more, right? So there's a evolution of the quality and service, right? And the third element is when you connect these two together, you have the underlying pressure on human capital and economy's ability to service this demand. So that means more people and maybe even more efficient or more qualified people providing services, right? And do you bring in fresh blood to fulfill it, or does it create competition with something else? So does it mean you're going to have less people in restaurants and more people in call centers? And then doesn't mean you're going to have more robots to serve that as waiters, right? So those dimensions are going to be critical. Just one example. We can talk about it more.
Yeah. Another question came in on this idea about substitutability. What about, maybe you can think and show us a little bit and think about the connection between not just the absolute substitutability of a supplier, but maybe of a whole process or thinking entirely different, and the connection back to innovation. To think, maybe we have to stop thinking like we were thinking. We need to rethink and re-innovate or innovate a whole new solution.
Yes, for it's maybe that's a great point. So let's maybe think of electricity, right? So in many countries of the world, electrical supply is not very reliable. So what you see is localized gensets, right? Which step in, which you have UPS backup, either battery based or diesel genset based, etc., where we say, okay, we depend on the utility for most of it, but should something happen, we have our own backups, right? Now let's use this analogy and take it to the manufacturing side. So let's say you're creating or you're putting together a big complex equipment, and for certain parts you have dependency on a faraway country. Now the value of those inputs might be not so much, but in terms of disruption or non-availability, it could be that you do not have, let's say it's these 5 simple screws that you cannot close it and ship it out, right? And the genset equivalent here would be, for example, having building in capacity of additive manufacturing, right? With designs ready to go. Of course, it is probably not as efficient, and it's not for scale, but it provides you backup, right? Yeah. So, and these are all things that we will need to institutionalize, because there's some other cases where you might just get rid of an entire part or entire process, or you might simply, instead of going from a part level, simply start sourcing the finished good, because there is a higher availability of the finished good and lesser availability of the parts.
Yeah,
Right?
sure.
Mhm.
Can you go to your phase 2 slide, your phase 1 and phase 2? There's a question came in. Thank you, Chander, nice to see you on the line, Chander. There's a question. The solutions included in phase 2 appear to be quite conventional and linear. Are there any disruptive solutions or suggestions are being taken by some of the companies? So maybe a little bit at a more specific, at a more granular level of a couple examples. Maybe we don't have to use client names, that's clear, but yeah.
I would say let's take the example of how companies are trying to secure inputs, right? You have seen Glencore and other mining companies, for example, getting into supply agreements with automotive suppliers, and this is public knowledge, that's why I can speak of it, to secure metal, right? Because they're going to need so much copper or so much aluminum or so much something, maybe not directly, right? But for their suppliers, right? So this is where you see companies not caring just about their immediate touch points across the organization or one step beyond, but really saying we are taking a longer term strategic view and saying we are competing with so many other industries, and we need to do something now so that in few years we are not out of basic inputs, or our suppliers are not out of it. And we do not know whether we'll be vulnerable or not, but we just want to be secure. We have clients who are entering completely different set of capabilities, right? I mean, you've had some automotive clients also decide to have their own semiconductor manufacturing setups, because they realize semiconductor is their Achilles heel, right? They were not able to ship out luxury cars because they didn't have this simple chip.
Yeah.
Right. So these are some examples where companies are being a bit more daring, and again, we can go into more details in a smaller circle, but just to give you an example. Yeah.
Can you go back to your first slide on the demographics? Here, there's a good question here is, when you show the 120, 146 versus the 20 on the, no, there's another one on where the trade flows are going with Europe and yeah. So the 109, the 146 and the 20s, looks like Europe, because of this, gets slammed the most. Is that but what other regions are really being slammed by this particular thing of the trade flows with Russia and Ukraine?
So there are, let's say, Europe is pretty much linked up with Russia when it comes to energy, right? There are pipelines. So it's kind of, I mean, I hate to use the word, but it's kind of linked to the umbilical cord, right? It is something which is permanent, right? Now you can argue that other parts of the world are also dependent on Russia and Ukraine, or let's say especially Russia, for energy like oil and gas. Yes, but the shipments is happening through ships, etc., and substitution, and those regions are designed to look for alternatives, because you could get a ship from the Middle East, or you could get a ship from Russia, and the economics plays a part, right? But if you see, Europe does not have so many different landing ports for pipelines. We're talking LNG terminals and linking them in, for example. Secondly, the difference here also is that besides commodities or inputs, right? This region also has been the manufacturing back kind of workshop, low-cost manufacturing workshop, and this is where we are talking of inputs, we're talking of components, we're talking of assemblies, sub-assemblies, for example, cables and wirings that go into automotive. We're talking of inputs which go into aircrafts, right? and so on and so forth. So there is also value added in this region for similar to what, for example, the US has with Mexico, right? So there's value added, there's back of production, and that's why the impact is also more severe, especially on the disruption side. Yeah. Does that address your query?
Yeah. You showed these one slide about some of the specific factors of the spikes, and one was on the chips.
Yeah.
Chips and semiconductors, it looks like it's going to be a long-term challenge, but we've seen this coming. Why doesn't it get corrected? Why doesn't somebody just say we're going to start a bunch more factories in here?
I think a lot more people are starting a bunch of factories. I mean, you probably read that Intel is investing in a big one. I mean, it is also part of the Inflation Reduction Act, some incentive towards chip manufacturing in Biden's recent production. I spoke of automotive companies setting up their own semiconductor production things. So this is happening, right? This is happening. Again, this is a good example where there is an interruption or disruption on the time scale. If you remember, as soon as people realize that it is going to be a longer term, then they feel they need to act.
Sure.
In this case, they were most of us were caught off guard, and this is why we say we need to do it proactively as an institution and institutionalize this.
So one of your jobs, I guess, especially, is being a sparring partner for the C-suite of big firms. Now that you're a partner at a big Roland Berger, and in your previous work and experience, you're expected kind of to have a magic ball, to be able to see forward and around the corner for firms, and predictive thinking. What are you telling C-suite executives to watch out for looking forward? We know the current situation, but as we're, okay, so things are happening faster and faster, more and more issues. Specifically, what areas do you say, hey, watch out for this, and which particular sectors do you think are going to be hit the most, you say in the next 2 to 3 years? I know that's it's almost impossible question to answer, but I know you get asked that all the time.
So I think first thing to start off with, we tell them there's no magic crystal ball, unfortunately.
Right? I thought there was. I thought that's what Roland Berger created. Right? No, I'm kidding.
Exactly. Yeah. But clearly and I started with this and said disruption. I mean, this is not a one-off. There's going to be more and more of this coming, right? And you cannot necessarily anticipate where you get blindsided by, which direction this is coming from. But what you can do is, within this sphere of influence, you cannot control the external factors, but you can mold your organization to be better prepared for these external accidents, right? And we've had a good variety of that. We've had economic factors, we've had commodity price increases, we've had significant demand destruction, and curtailment of trade flows because of restrictions. One because of biohazards, other because of geopolitics, etc. So you've got a good flavor of what kind of issues can happen. And I think what we need to do together is to sit down and analyze how do we build an organization that can anticipate it and can deal with it. And it's going to need more than just let's create a 5-year business, let's create a strategy and 5-year business plan and go with it, right? It is going to be, okay, we have this direction, and we have to watch out for these flags, and we have to build a stronger awareness of enterprise risk, and we have to build significantly augment risk mitigation and risk management in every dimension. I mean, I just mentioned a few. It goes all the way to the enabling functions. It goes to procurement. It goes to human capital. I mean, you had the big resignation, right? So what do you do when you don't have the right people, or when you're no longer as attractive, or somebody else is more attractive to your talent, right? So it has multiple.
In Switzerland currently, the unemployment rate is below the systemic unemployment level. It's a 40-year low. There's just no one on the market, right? How do you handle that, right?
Yeah.
With just natural fluctuation.
Yes. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So this is a bit more, and especially if, a lot of the newer, let's say newer economy companies have been more exposed to market forces and had to adapt. But this is where we are now is testing the resilience of the more established players. So I think that's a big change.
So I'm going to keep pushing this a little bit, so a little bit to be provocative. You say it's not a one-off. The screen in front of us is showing it's taking place faster and faster, more and more frequently, more and more severe. When you learned corporate finance at the time, we were doing, projections in BV calculations based on 10-year calculations, and then it was 7 years, and then it's 5 years. Recently, I talked to a CFO of a large traded Swiss company who saying they're looking at 1.5 years forward. That's all they can really guesstimate and predict with accuracy. So if that's the case, should we just do away with budgeting and strategic planning and just altogether? I mean, if you can't plan past 1.5 years or 3 years for real good numbers, how do we do this? It's quite a challenge.
So, I mean, I think if let's use this chart, right? If you zoom in, you will see that it is not, despite its peaks and troughs, in between in areas where it was relatively flat, it wasn't truly flat, right? It's just the average, correct? So, what this means is it is very important to set, let's say, the 5-year, 10-year direction and invest for 5-year, 10-year direction, because big things take time, right? And to break it down into concrete milestones that we want to achieve. But there's a reason the mile markers are after miles, right? Because in between you can take a detour, you can make a pit stop, etc. But then as long as you get back on the road and you hit the mile marker, you're moving forward. So I think budgeting, it's a strategic planning and budgeting and everything else is very critical, because it puts those mile markers in, right? But if a quarter or two doesn't go the way it does, and there is this causality, there's good reason why it hasn't. It just gives you it's a reality check to say, okay, do we have the miles? Are we going the right direction? But then, if yes, is this something that forces us to change the direction, or should we really fuss about 1 or 2 spoiled quarters because suddenly there was a trade embargo here or there, or there was a geopolitical issue? Or should we just trust in it, believe it, and keep going? And maybe a detour here, a detour there. I mean, one analogy, if you will allow me, it's the difference between driving a car on an autobahn and sailing in the sea, right? Because in the autobahn you have clear paths, right? This is the direction. This is the direction you're going. These are the exits. This is where you get in or get out. But as you're sailing, you set the direction. But as the wind changes, you have to constantly adjust your sail. You of course go eventually there, but every few meters or every few minutes, if the wind changes, you have to adapt. And it's more about getting from the autobahn to the sailway, to be honest.
You talked about having this plan for the future. The challenge for big firms is that they might have the resources and can throw money and resources at the planning, and maybe be too slow to be able to do it. And the small firms don't have the resources, but are quicker or more agile to actually make a change. Where do you start with this whole process of this protective planning, the risk planning, the strategic planning? It's all also pretty interrelated. How do firms really kickstart this type of journey?
I think this is why we say know thyself, and that was this is where the phase one of how vulnerable are you is effectively how well do you know your organization, right?
Yeah, and
Not just your dependence on certain inputs, but also your organizational capabilities, which I did not dwell upon too much. Um, do you have the right people to deal with this? So once you recognize that this is your true level of risk, or this is your true level of exposure, and these are the troops you have, then it then you say, do we have a gap, and then you can start. But unless you inform yourself and unless you get to do a true rigorous self-reflection,
mhm.
you could put in a lot of resources or less. It's not going to help you.
But it's still it's a hard process. It's really it's a tough process to begin even this this self-awareness or this collateral risk.
Absolutely,
Right?
but I mean to make it, let's make it more concrete, right? So if you're corporation A, global corporation, with a lot of with let's say 20, 30 different businesses, lot of activity internally, you have centuries of experience in your senior leadership.
Mhm.
It's just about getting those people together in a room and saying, okay, guys, let's together work on where are we weak, and you'll find at least the first level of inputs will come from that group, but then in a structured manner with this team, and maybe with some inputs from experts from outside, you could fairly quickly get to the key issues that you need to be worried about. I mean, post Ukraine, Russia worked with the client in Europe, rather large one, was saying, okay, we want to understand where this is going, and it started off with, are we going to have World War III? Are we going to have, East Bloc, West Bloc, blah, blah, blah. And then we said, okay, let's look at scenarios. Let's look at what happens here, what happens there. Then which parts of your supply chains are affected, which regions you can source from, and which inputs. And then we started going into the organization. We said, well, actually, let's also pull out places where you're firefighting now, where compare them with where you were fighting 12 months ago. Talk about where you have the longest lead time. So there's a lot of data points in the organization, with a little bit of concerted and structured approach, which can give you tremendous insights. And nobody knows your business better than you, because you've been doing it for decades, maybe centuries.
Sure. Good.
Right. So
as you're talking with the at the top level about these types of things, then they're going back inside. The last question, because I'm looking at the clock a little bit. I'm cognizant about the audience also committing their lunchtime to being with us. But what, if we bring that down to some of the core operations or enabling functions, what type of change is required there for this adaptation to this new DNA thinking?
So, as I gave you the example of for example, strengthening risk management and mitigation, which is a totally different dimension in many of the industrial firms than, for example, a commodity firm would do, right? Which is far closer to that. We are talking about a difference in human capitals. Again, you need a different set of people to steady the ship, and different or let's say drive the ship in steady waters, and different for the storm. So that's a mix of people. You're talking much more emphasis on data analytics, using all of that internal data that you have. But again, with just throwing tools at it is not going to help. What you need is the experience to say, what do we need to look for, and what do we need to watch for? What kind of an organizational disruption dashboard do we need to create, right? So which of those functions are more critical? Is it procurement? Is it manufacturing? Is it logistics, right? What happens if we have to, I'll give you an example. What happens if You've seen the water levels in Rhine, etc. What happens if we cannot put things on a ship and ship it down the water? We need more trucks. Do we have more trucks? So that says it's logistics, right? So and these are some things which need a holistic, but I think harmonized link. You cannot do them in silos. You need to get the organization the right frame of mind, and then for the enabling functions, some of the elements I mentioned, human capital, finance, right?
Any final comments from your side about encouragement to the leaders and the managers who are on this call about being resilient and in this age of disruption?
I'd say there are three positives, right? First, you don't have to convince people that we need to be more agile, resilient, etc. Right? Kind of the world has done it for you. So, second, along with, necessity is the mother of invention. So when you have situations like this, you have solutions as well. And what you need are people who believe something needs to change. And now we have that belief something needs to change. And there are plenty of, and people are open to listen to this. And a lot of the organizations are experimenting with change. Third, this is also been, and this is also going to be a great period of human self-development. Because you've seen a lot of people who have reflected on saying, okay, in these situations, not just organizations, who am I? What are my strengths? How did I deal with this change? Does it mean that I can deal with this better? It has opened a lot more opportunities for people to try and change and experiment. And I think that's just fantastic.
Great. Manish, thank you so much for your insights today. Dear audience, thank you for participating in today's webinar. We look forward, we're going to follow up this mail to the people who have registered with some summary slides from Manish and his contacts if you need and want more information from him and how his company might be able to support you, as well as a link to the video that's being recorded. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our future webinars coming up soon. Manish, dear all.
Thank you so much. It was such an honor to be here, and thanks for all these great questions as well.
Thanks so much.